Hello and welcome to Earth, and on this episode the aliens make their resurgence and humanity has to fight for survival one more time on Independence Day. In the 20 years since the initial attack, the survivors have tried to rebuild society and their lives, with all countries uniting together to create the Earth Space Defense to protect the world from harm. When David Levinson, played by Jeff Goldblum, discovers a distress signal in a mining ship in Africa, the planet must prepare for an even greater attack from a gigantic mothership with an alien queen inside that spans the length of the Atlantic Ocean. Now the ESD and the residents of Area 51 must find a way to stave off their extinction once again. It may be hard for young viewers to recall, I'm barely even old enough to remember it myself, but in the summer of 1996, Independence Day wasn't just any other movie, it was an event. There was hype all summer long, building up from that dramatic Super Bowl spot where we saw the White House being blown up by the laser of an alien spaceship. That became the signature of the entire marketing campaign that pretty much drew audiences in, especially the tagline, July 2nd they arrive, July 3rd they attack, on July 4th we fight back. That's not actually how the timeline of that movie goes, but it certainly drew people's imagination and it became a huge hit. It changed the way that blockbuster movies and the way they're marketed forever. The Independence Day pretty much pioneered the idea of showing all the big money shots in the trailer, for example. It's basically one of the most copied movies over the last 20 years. Even the director, Rowan Emmerich himself, has spent much of his career afterwards trying to replicate the success of that movie in any other form, like Godzilla, The Day After Tomorrow, and then lapsing completely into self-parody with 2012. And of course, he's having another go at it with this sequel. I think the problems with Independence Day 2 start with the fact that it's trying to outdo the original movie, and the original film was enormous, basically, so this one's trying to be gigantic. And you can really tell when you're watching it that it's spreading itself far too thinly, especially with regard to the returning characters. Jeff Goldblum, Judd Hirsch's father, Bill Pullman, Vivica A. Fox, Brent Spiner. See, they bring all those players back to name but a few, but they're all spread out over these different locations. And I understand what they're trying to do here. The movie's trying to replicate the feel of the first movie in some sense, in that the original film for its first hour was split between 3 different locations, New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. And they try to do that here because we have the 3 settings of Area 51, but also Africa initially, and the moon base. That doesn't really work. What they're using them for is to try and give you an engagement point to create the new characters around them. So you have Jeff Goldblum by himself with new characters. The problem with the sequel is that you want to see the characters come back, sure, but you want to see them interact with each other, and it's surprising how little the returning players interact with each other. For example, Bill Pullman and Jeff Goldblum, they're only in 2 scenes together, for example. It fails at recapturing the spirit of the original movie, and that's because a lot of it's been homogenized. Resurgence is made in a much less American-centric film landscape. You can tell when they made this sequel, they really tried to downplay those elements, and they really shouldn't, because yeah, we make fun of Independence Day for the fact that it's so America, yeah! And jingoistic and patriotic, which is funny because it's made by a German filmmaker, but that gave that movie its kind of heart, and it really kind of rallies you up. And Resurgence has none of that. It's taken all the personality away from the concept. It's a movie called Independence Day, for crying out loud. It's gonna need some jingoism, if you ask me. But instead, that element has been so downplayed here, aside from a couple of lines from not Will Smith, it's the 4th of July, let's light some fireworks. It could be at any other time. There's no real reference to it being Independence Day apart from a couple of lines. See, it kind of explains why they were so focused on America the first time around, because once you stretch it out to being the entire world, it's very easy to kind of lose scale and perspective, and this is really a very, very all over the place kind of sequel, because they're trying to put in way too much here. But also, you've got the obvious pandering towards the Chinese market in this film, because America and China have teamed up together in the Earth Space Defense Program, and it's supposedly the entire world, the whole world has gone into world peace after the alien attacks, trying to be one world essentially. But the only thing that we actually see from this is, oh, we have a couple of token Chinese characters to appeal to that particular market. In particular, Angela Baby, who plays one of the pilots. The devastation in this movie is much more international, and one of the key ingredients in a disaster movie is how much destruction you can wreak on screen. It's not the whole story. I think a lot of people get that wrong when they make disaster movies, but when you look back at the original Independence Day, that initial attack sequence is still incredibly impressive to this day. It still holds up, and I think in large part that's because it's one of the very last movies that use a huge amount of model work. Those were scale models that they blew up in front of the camera, and they feel real. They have an actual tangible weight to them that makes them very eerily realistic. There's something genuinely kind of chilling and impactful about it. And Resurgence tries to top that with this signature sequence that pretty much happens at around the same time as the first movie, where the initial attack is basically the mothership landing over Europe and Asia on the way over to the Atlantic, and it's sucking everything up into its gravitational field, and then it dumps it down on London, and Hemsworth and Goldblum, along with everyone else, has to fly through the debris field. Cute idea, but it's also a very, very convoluted one on screen. It's so busy and very, very, very digital looking. The destruction is way bigger in Independence Day Resurgence, but it also feels far more fake. There's no kind of weight or impact to it. When they destroy London, there are no characters based in London like there was in the initial attacks in the first film. You don't care about the huge amount of off-screen casualties. I think Charlotte Gainsbourg says something along the lines of, "My family lived there in London." See, that's the huge problem with Independence Day Resurgence. I didn't care about anything, and that surprised me, to be honest, because I really like Independence Day. It's probably the only properly good movie that Roland Emmerich has ever made. And yeah, I've been critical on Roland Emmerich movies in the past, like 2012 and so forth, but here the characters are so thinly sketched. So you have the returning players like Jeff Goldblum, and Jeff Goldblum is just kind of there to give exposition, essentially. He has a few moments where it reminds you of his character from the first film, but not much. Bill Pullman's kind of in and out of the movie. It appears that the alien mind lock from the first film has suddenly transformed him into Randy Quaid. He's become this doomsday soothsayer. But it never gives any of these characters anything interesting to do when they return. Judd Hirsch has the worst subplot of all, in that he is separated from Goldblum for the entire length of the movie, which is strike one, by the way, because Goldblum and Hirsch have so much chemistry together when they're on screen. You can see that in the first movie, and when they're eventually reunited in this movie, you do get a nice little welcome bit of nostalgia there. But far too much of this film is Judd Hirsch going on a road trip with these teens, led by a surly Joey King, who is incredibly annoying in this movie. Incredibly annoying could be the byword for half the characters in this film, for example, and nothing happens with those characters. All those scenes are basically filler. In terms of the new characters, they're even less interesting. They're so generic and hodgepodge. Liam Hemsworth is ostensibly the lead actor in this movie, and he's got the look of a leading man, but he's so painfully lacking in charisma. And the same thing goes for Jesse T. Usher, who has to step into the unenviable task of filling Will Smith's shoes, because, in case you didn't know, Will Smith declined to do this movie because he did After Earth, and that didn't get a very good that didn't get a very good reaction, so he's kind of not doing sci-fi movies anymore, and he did Suicide Squad instead. And so what they've done to get around that is they've killed his character off between movies. Apparently his character died while testing out these alien-enhanced superjets. Usher and Hemsworth have this rivalry between them that's set up that goes precisely nowhere. It's all discarded in about a scene and then it never comes up again, so why bother even having it? I suppose, yeah, you could say that about the argument between Goldblum and Pullman in the first movie, but they build us up to be a major thing in this movie, and then it just kind of is discarded by the halfway point. And so much of this movie is sort of interesting ideas that are discarded by about the halfway point. You've got this idea that the world is rebuilding itself, and they've utilised alien technology to try and make up for their losses, but at the same time, the world is kind of hurting because everyone knows someone who has died in the initial onslaught. And so you have this idea that's very briefly flirted with, that this is a world full of orphans, essentially, that's promptly never brought up again after it's mentioned. And among the other new characters, you've got Travis Tope as a fellow pilot, and he's annoying because his subplot is that he wants a girlfriend, and as soon as he sees Angela Baby walk out, he goes, "Dibs! Attractive Chinese woman! Dibs, dibs, dibs!" You haven't even talked to her. You literally just looked at her and said, well, I'm going to try and get a date from her. Although, then again, in terms of the annoyance stakes, we've also got this government official that keeps following around Goldblum, and he gets this arc of trying to become a warrior. No, please, can someone shoot this guy? He is a terrible comic relief. And then we have Diobra Operai as this African warlord, and thank goodness this movie drops this particular element quite quick. There is this subplot in the early stages of this movie in that Africa is the place where the aliens had this most kind of psychic connection to the inhabitants, and it engages in this really uncomfortable racial element and sort of mysticism. You remember that shot at the very end of Independence Day where all the ships are coming down, they show Africa, and it's a bunch of guys with spears in the air, and there's that really kind of stereotypical, patronising, borderline offensive representation. It's like that little tiny shot there has been extended out into this subplot. Good grief, I was thankful when we got out of Africa in this movie. You've got Stella Ward as a female president who has no personality other than getting things wrong all the time. You've got William Fichtner in the movie, who's always welcome because he's William Fichtner, but he's basically playing William Fichtner. The best new cast member is Micah Monroe. It might as well be a new role because it has nothing in common with what Mae Whitman was playing in the first movie. There's been a bit of controversy about the recasting in this film, and whatever reason you come up for it is really kind of sketchy and a bit icky, because I reckon Whitman could have played this part if she wanted to, but clearly they wanted someone who was more of a traditional action girl, and so we get Micah Monroe, and I like Micah Monroe. She was good in The Guest, and It Follows, and this is her second alien invasion film this year after The Fifth Wave, and she gives the strongest performance not because of what the script gives her, which is basically her being concerned for all the other male characters in her life, essentially. But she does give a lot to that role, and when the script finally gives her something to do, when she finally gets to fly around in a jet, she does embrace that part. I kind of wish that she was given a lot more to do. But when it comes to annoying characters, it's not just the new ones, let's be fair, because Brent Spiner is brought back as Dr. Oken, who was briefly in the first movie and had a rather unfortunate close encounter being used as a psychic mind puppet for an alien and was strangled, and we presumed he was dead in the first movie, but it turns out we were all wrong. He merely went into a 20-year coma, as you do, and he wakes up at the beginning of the movie, and this is so stupid. It's implied that it's because of his psychic connection with the aliens, and he makes Steven Seagal in Hard to Kill look like a wuss, because he just bounces out of bed, goes, "Oh, are the aliens back again? Back to work!" No signs of muscle atrophy whatsoever, and there's all this comic relief with this character that doesn't need to be there. It's so forced, And yes, you do get to see Data's bum crack in this movie. Thanks for that, filmmakers. And it really tries to mine the nostalgia of the first movie, copies major sequences from that film, like the sequence where Okun is possessed, except this time it's with Bill Pullman's former president. And you've got other sequences that are replicated. The climax of this movie is a lift from the previous film. It's not the complete ending of the movie, but it's a major part of the climax, and yeah, they're trying to, bring back elements to say, yeah, this is Independence Day, do you remember this bit in Independence Day? But it feels like they don't really have any new ideas here. And the new ideas that don't connect. You've got this alien queen thing, and it just feels like Roland has dusted off his copy of Aliens, and said, you know what we should do in this follow-up to an Aliens movie? We should have an alien queen. That makes things totally different, and will even lift the design right off of that movie with the huge kind of head and sort of plate on top of it. It looks exactly the same as the alien queen in that movie. Very, very shamelessly ripped off. It's regurgitating all those sequences, but because you have far less emotional connection to them, they all just fall flat, they have no dramatic weight to them. And it just feels like we're going through the motions. I've seen this movie before, made 20 years ago. It was much better. Incidentally, on one final note, I saw this movie in 3D. Don't copy my mistake. Most of this movie takes place in the dark. About 60% of it, I'd roughly estimate. It's people running around in the darkened Area 51 base, or on the moon, or in Africa at night, or inside the darkness of the mothership. What I'm saying is that there's almost no stereoscope to be seen. There are a couple of moments that look vaguely impressive. It's not a total Warcraft situation, which was a horrible post-conversion job, but this is purely to extort more money out of the viewer, and there's no reason to see it in this format. Simply see it flat, you'll have a much better time with it. Independence Day Resurgence is another belated sequel that fails to match up to its predecessor. It tries to capture the audience's nostalgia for the original with a returning cast and whole scenes replayed identically, but it gives them little new to care about, with far too much of the film focusing on blandly generic young leads or annoying subplots that go nowhere. Despite the greater level of chaos, the cavalcade of CGI work feels weightless and has none of the impact of the original's models, itself diluted by 2 decades of impersonators, including this very sequel. Worse, there's little of the original movie's knowingly cheesy charm or its goofy patriotism, stripping it of the franchise's personality, and there's only so much Jeff Goldblum can do. Coming up soon, Kelsey Grammer's Breaking the Bank comes off the shelf, Stellan Skarsgård is our kind of traitor, and we see what tree The Secret Life of Pets is barking up. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.